So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. We are going to be continuing with our Managing in the Midst of this Current Outbreak series with Christine Forner. Christine, welcome. Great to have you back.
It's so lovely to be here. It's nice seeing you again.
All right. So since 2011, Christine has worked in her own private practice, which specializes in complex trauma and dissociative disorders. She has over 20 years experience working with individuals with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorders, traumatic dissociation, and developmental trauma. She's a current clinical supervisor at Wheatland Sexual Assault Centre in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and teaches locally at an international level on the issue of dissociation, complex trauma, and the intersection of dissociation and mindfulness. Christine was the treasurer of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation and was the past president of the ISSTD in 2019. All right, Christine, so we spoke a while ago. We set this up in the midst of all this, and with the idea that you would come on and talk about this. And I know you recently wrote an article in Clinical Neuropsychiatry titled "A Missing Ingredient in a Time of Fear: Carers Are Not the Bucket," and we'll go on to talk about that. But in that article, you bring up a lot of interesting points, and we can touch upon those. But first off, how are you doing? Safe, healthy, hopefully?
I'm doing quite well. I seem to be following the same patterns as most of the people that I've been still continuously getting to see via Zoom. First week, everybody was a little excited and a little nervous, but most people are like, you get to rest. Second week, people are like, okay, maybe this isn't okay. By third week, people were like, this isn't okay. And then last week, so that's week number 4 into this, people really started not doing very well. I in particular found last week a little bit tougher. I find that as therapists, the teleconferencing is actually exhausting. Like you're having to draw upon probably skills that you might not be drawing upon as heavily in the therapeutic session when it's face to face. But if you're trying to connect, you're not just connecting through the person who's there, you're having to connect through the screen to that person. And so I think it's bringing up some extra energy that perhaps we're not used to using. But other than that, I'm doing pretty good, trying not to put on the COVID-15 like everybody else, but all in around, I get to be with my kids, and I'm very privileged in a lot of ways, and I'm very grateful for that privilege.
So, I mean, if we can start by, and I know you talk about this in your article, talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on how what's going on is impacting us from a macro or global level. And I know that's a huge question, but
yeah, no, like really, if we're speaking about macros and globals, we'll noticing like if you can pick up patterns that when this starts to happen at first, there was this overwhelming outpour of, can I help? How can I help? How can we take care of this? And that's actually starting to wear off a little bit where we're at. And so we are probably 2 to 3 weeks behind what New York was under. So we're sort of watching it come towards us and moving westward as it's moving westward.
And you're in Canada.
Yeah, I'm up in Canada. I'm up in Western Canada. And you can see that people are starting to really not be okay with being still, with being following a grander collective need that the individual is starting to kick in, that I think a lot of people's developmental traumas are starting to come to the surface. I think a lot of people who aren't able to do what they normally do to manage any type of childhood trauma or any type of developmental trauma or any type of attachment breach, they're not able to do what they were supposed to do. So for example, if a lot of people don't know how to go in and regulate their central nervous system from an internal, profoundly sort of intimate, caring way, they may have learned how to exercise or how to work or how to focus on this or focus on that as a way of sort of dealing with what they're feeling rather than fixing what they're feeling. And they can't do that anymore. So they're sort of sitting at home, and all of that stuff is going to bubble to the surface because when we are safe, that's when the stuff comes out. That's when we feel like that's when the human body repairs, is when we're safe. That's when the human body repairs, is when we're isolated or when we're in closer structures. So a lot of people are probably going to be experiencing much more irritability than normal, much more anger than normal, much more sadness than normal, much more depression than normal, if they can't get out and do the things that they may have done to mitigate the dysregulation
Mhm.
rather than going in and managing the dysregulation.
And those ways that people are or have been doing that are kind of fly in the radar in the sense fly under the radar in the sense that they're socially acceptable, right? And they're almost disguised, right? I'm working out, and you don't sometimes it's easy not to really think about why you are working out, right?
Yeah.
You're doing
Yeah.
all these things, and um now, like you're saying, people aren't able to go to the gym and so forth, and all these things are. So talk a little bit more about, you're saying it's developmental trauma coming up in a sense. Talk about that more.
Yeah. So, um, in the last, I specialize in complex trauma, dissociation, and mindfulness, and really the work that I have been able to examine, explore, and explore and research. There's really not very many people who look at those worlds of dissociation, and mindfulness, um, and I think that might have to do with language, but it also has to do with a lot of people associate trauma with the big hits, with the big physical hits, the big car accidents, or the big sexual assaults. A lot of people don't understand that passive neglect, not being paid attention to, not getting your needs met in the first 3 years of life, it's painful. It hurts. That's how a child's body communicates the distress, is by the sensory physical pain. So when a child is being left alone, or a child is whose parents aren't um, able to regulate that central nervous system in the way that central nervous system is requesting, by through affect, so by crying, by making the noises, making the body movements to express what's happening internally, if that doesn't get met, the end result is actually pain. So we have pain of the need not being met. And then if the need isn't met, then there's also this experience of my needs aren't being met. And the person who's supposed to need them isn't needing them, either on purpose or, and infants can't think these things, they feel these things. So they start getting this double injury of the first problem not being fixed, and now the second problem of I'm not existing, I'm not here. Those things hurt. And when we go in to feel these things through our affective system, it hurts. And if you don't know how to go in and manage that vulnerability and manage the emotionality of those pain, then it's going to stay, and you're going to figure out how to avoid it or do all sorts of things to manage that pain. And this is something that is very passive and extraordinarily common, because a lot of the ways that we tend to raise children in the last several hundreds of years, particularly in North American or sort of white European cultures, is to be very dismissive of infants and children's experiences, feelings, sensations, needs, wants, and all that kind of stuff. And so you have a bunch of people who are doing as a way of coping rather than sitting and dealing.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when that stuff comes up, oftentimes we don't know the genesis of it, the origination of it, right? I'm not
That's right.
thinking, I mean, a lot of people aren't thinking to themselves, oh, my anxiety or this uncomfortable feeling is a result of this developmental trauma that happened so many years ago,
Yeah,
which makes it more challenging to deal with.
exactly. Right. Like if you think about something like what commonly gets called a panic attack, right? So a person is just starting to get so terrified and they don't know how to manage their terror, and it doesn't make sense to them. So it just gets labeled that I have a panic attack disorder. But what panic really probably is, and what a lot of neuroscience shows that it is an attachment cry. It's a neurophysiological system where all the nervous system is doing everything it can to inform the nearest human being, I'm in danger, can you please come and help? And if you have these attacks as a child and it doesn't get met, any of the circumstances that were similar to the very first experience, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, feeling, thought, any of those circumstances can send the body into another panic attack, because it's like, oh, okay, we're here. This is what we do. No one's coming. This is how we get by. Because if we did it the first time, we're going to do it all throughout our lifetime. Just like when we first start to walk, or when we first start to talk, or when we first start to learn language. Once that O becomes an O, it's pretty much set in stone. So once a panic attack gets ignored, that's pretty much going to be set in stone. That person now learns that I need to ignore this rather than deal with this.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here. So I hear you saying that a lot of the discomfort, a lot of us are feeling, a lot of the anxiety and stress, though debilitating to a certain degree and serious, is normal
Very normal.
to
We're
in
frightened.
response to what's going on.
Yeah, this is scary. It is scary,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like it's frightening to know that both of my parents, who are very at risk, if one of them gets them, the chances of both of them getting them is really high, and the chances of them getting through it really high. That terrifies me.
Mm-hmm.
But if I have experiences in my childhood where I have felt that feeling of vulnerability, and that feeling of vulnerability was not tended to, cared for, or nurtured by my parents, then however that vulnerability was dealt with is likely how I'm going to deal with it. So if for those lucky individuals whose parents taught them how to manage uncontrollable vulnerability, they're going to be doing okay in this event. For those of us, or for people whose parents did not know how to handle infant vulnerability, terror, panic, rage, fear, which are most emotions children aren't allowed to express, then as an adult, you're going to express it the same way that you were taught to deal with it. So if you were taught to care for it, you will. If you were taught to ignore it, you will. If you were taught to shame it, you likely will. If you were taught to be violent towards it, you likely will. It's just like we're a procedurally learning creature.
So for the people listening now, who are maybe driving, going, "Oh my God, what am I supposed to do? So what am I
So
supposed to do?"
the beautiful thing is that we all have this thing called a ventral medial prefrontal cortex. We have these upper brain structures that are inside almost everybody. Whether they're working or not is a different thing. But these ventral medial prefrontal structures are the same structures that are involved in mindfulness. They're the same structures that are involved in anything that is repetitive or contemplative. So when we are sewing, the ventral medial prefrontal can come up. When we're whittling, when we're coloring, when we're praying, when we are meditating, when we're doing mantras, when we're doing that sort of sitting, internal, going in, that brain structure is designed to manage our neuroception. So the answers are actually all inside of us. Learning how to tend to and care for is probably the hardest thing that most trauma survivors can learn. How do I care for this brutal feeling that comes with all of this lack of care? How do I learn to care for that when I was never taught? And going in and learning how to sit with that suffering, and maybe ask the suffering questions, maybe asking the suffering, like, how would you give that suffering dignity rather than shame? Because most of us, when we start to feel this awful shame kicks in, I am no good, I'm terrible, this hurts, this is bad. It's learning how to go in and go, okay, this feeling of mine, what is it actually trying to communicate? So we try to, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is a brain structure that's one step removed, and it's more designed to manage the defensive brain structures that come from our traumas. Our mind is not so good if we've got a lot of traumas. The mind is actually really good at avoiding this if
Mm-hmm.
this can't get fixed. But the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is really designed to go in and fix this, whatever these may be. And in my experience, it takes some time to teach people to do this. But once they start to feel that initial panic or that initial freak out or that initial rage, it's actually, if you can ask yourself the question, what's intelligent about my rage? What's my rage trying to communicate? What does it need? Because all of these things are just needs. It's the only
Now,
reason we got them.
this is bringing up a lot of, for me, what you wrote in this article. Again, the title is "A Missing Ingredient in a Time of Fear."
Yeah.
Carers are not the bucket, and that was in clinical neuropsychiatry. I'll have a link. Can I have a link? Can I put this up in
Yeah,
the show
yeah.
notes
It's
page?
open
Okay.
access. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's start talking about this, because I think this is a really interesting article, and it's a really interesting article for um, uh, therapists out there, because it has a lot of, you bring up a lot of points that don't come up often from my experience.
Mhm.
So let's kind of bring this in. First of all, why did you write this?
I was asked to write this a couple of I think I was asked to write it a day or two after I got back from San Francisco. We attempted to have the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation conference, and it got canceled like 5 minutes before. We had to cancel it 5 minutes before, based on instructions from the California government. So I had made my way back. I had trouble getting back, but I finally got back. The next day, I was asked by one of the editors, because of my role as being the immediate past president, if I would like to write an article. And I said, sure, because, often you don't get asked by a journal to write an article. So when you're asked by a journal to write an article, it's actually, it's a big thing that I thought about. And then I was like, what am I going to write about? Because I've written about dissociation mindfulness a lot. It's actually almost getting to the point where it's like ad nauseum for me. I know it's brand new for a lot of people, but I've been talking about this for almost 15 years now. And so my mind has really been thinking lately about misogyny again. My original degree was in women's studies back many, 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 many years ago. And I haven't really visited my feminist roots in a long time while I was thinking about mindfulness. And I think when I discovered that there's brain structures inside us that are the same brain structures that produce that mindful state, those brain structures are incredibly aligned with regulation and co-regulation, empathy, compassion, um, dignity, tolerance, love. Like, there's brain structures that are just not, they're not, the only thing they are designed to do is love other human beings and help them feel safe, and that in turn helps us feel safe. And so in the last couple of years, I'm thinking, well, how did misogyny get here? Because it's not in our brain structure. There's nothing in there that helps us tolerate human to human cruelty. And so in my head, the two must have been connected. So then I started going back and looking at deep archaeology and reading My Chalice and the Blades again, and the great Cosmic Goddess books that influenced me back in the early 90s. And it was going back and reviewing them, thinking that it's human harm that ancient man would not understand. It's that lag that you're talking about, the genesis of these feelings. Ancient man wouldn't understand it because modern man has a hard time understanding it. And I think that somehow women got seen as the evokers of this pain and suffering after the effect that after human harm has happened. And when we are working with clients, because like, it's just sort of this accumulation of all these things coming together that help me put the pieces together, that misogyny is probably comes from post-traumatic, the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, the effects of dissociative disorders, the effects of human to human harm. And so, like, it's almost universal when you're working with traumatized people. There's the reason why we do this triphasic model, and why most organizations and most therapeutic principles talk about a triphasic model. Why do we start slowly? Why don't we dive in there? And it's because when you dive in there and you give all the tenderness that you can, and you give all the affection that you can in a bounded, therapeutic, respectful way. But when you are being very kind to a human being who's not really had a lot of experience of being kind, all of the feelings of the pain and suffering that the dissociation is hiding comes flying out. And so for a lot of people who spend a lot of time working with complex trauma, you learn to hold back your tenderness, you learn to hold back your care, because it does overwhelm them. And so it was just sort of this accumulation of putting these notions together that really, I sort of was working in my office one day and it went bing. Yeah, I would be willing to bet misogyny is a side effect of human to human harm that has just gone unchecked for 6,000 to 10,000 years.
For someone who's experienced, let's say, severe trauma, who also exhibits dissociation or experiences dissociation, when they are shown that kindness and tenderness, you said it. What does it do specifically? It threatens that dissociation.
No, it actually, I think care removes the dissociative barrier. right? So dissociation is a biomechanical, neurobiological process where the thalamus, and the periaqueductal gray. So these are deep, deep brain structures. They're actually even below the amygdala. So they're more primitive than the amygdala, and they run down the brain stem. Those are the brain structures that really are in charge of dissociation. So when the body feels like it has reached a tipping point where it can't feel this, it dissociates. When it feels like it reaches a tipping point where it can't escape, the thalamus also sort of scatters information. So the insula stops working as well. And it is different than fight or flight. Fight or flight, the insula is still working, but the front brain structure is turned off. With
Mm.
dissociation, the inactive defenses, the insula is cut off so that you can still think, but there's nothing coming to it. There are actually pieces missing. And it is an anesthetic. And when you apply care, the anesthetic comes off. And all the original feelings and the original sensations come to the surface. And if you don't have a way of managing this, if you
Right.
don't have any type of knowing how to tend to care for, be introspective, any of those things, that's your bottom. You don't have that underknowing of what care is. And because as Homo sapiens, care is our primary first thing. Bonding is what we do before we need to eat. I often say, a lot of people, when their babies first put on a womb and it starts to squirm its way up to the nipple, everybody assumes that it's doing that to get food. But you think about it, that baby's probably still attached to the umbilical cord. It just got out of a whole bunch of fluid that it's been drinking and breathing in. That tummy cannot be empty enough to be driving hunger, the way to move that little baby body.
Mm.
But bonding would.
Mm.
The need to bond to a human being and to have that human being bond to you, for us humans, that's our first place. And that's so that when Bowlby said we need people more than we need food, that's, I think, what he was talking about.
Right, right. So
Mm-hmm.
this, you're talking about going slower, right? Taking these incremental steps to provide that safety so that what the
You build
dissociation,
tolerance, right? So
right,
this can
right.
build tolerance. They can build this foundation that they can understand that if they fall and crash, something will catch them. If they have chronic dissociation or flipping between active and inactive defenses, they have no knowledge that there's anything will catch them, because they're
Mm-hmm.
at they're at the end point. If you chronically dissociate, what's next? Well, death, right? And so for them, they don't understand that underneath it is this safety, this tenderness, this care that can hold all of this trauma.
So where does care, explain carers are not the bucket?
Okay, so when my son, I think the best way to describe this is because a lot of times, especially I've noticed with particularly war vets or men the male clients that I have that come from very masculine cultures or traditional, like our like an army culture or a very strong male culture where emotion isn't allowed, where vulnerability isn't allowed. I often find that if I turn on my need to, like, just even the eye contact and moving my body in and making myself move into more of a role of being a carer, sends them through the roof. Boom, they are
Mm.
just there. They can't tolerate what's being brought up inside of them, and they tend to get angry. They can tend to get defensive, and it's having to pull back and be a little more aloof, a little bit more distant, in helping that system tolerate their own feelings inside that care produces. So when I was working with, so my son had a really bad stomach flu when he was about 3.5, and he started to do the things that children do when they're going to throw up. You can kind of tell. And I would bring him the bucket, and the first couple times he threw up in the bucket, and then the third time he's like, "No bucket," and he tossed the bucket really far because he made the assumption that the bucket was creating his pain and suffering. Because he's a little kid and he didn't have the brain capacity to understand that it was an invisible virus. And when we come in and we care, when therapists care and or other people come in care, those emotions inside are going to come to the surface. But without the objectivity, without the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, so the brain structures that will remind us person is one step removed, you're just going to feel pain every time that person comes close. You're going to make the assumption that that person is the source of your pain, not something from the inside. You're not going to make the assumption that this is actually a memory rather than the person who is coming in for tenderness. Because, what did we do 50,000 years ago when we would, have an attack by a saber-toothed tribe. Well, we probably went back to the cave when we became safe, and then we started to discharge, which is stuff that comes from somatic experiencing and sensory motor. It's a physiological nerve release of all the intensity of the neurochemistry that comes when we are in our defensive or active or inactive body states. When we get safe, this stuff starts coming out. When we start to heal, we start to shake. When we start to heal, we start to cry. That's the way that the body's releasing all of this neurochemical electricity and all of the states that happen when we're in these active defensive states. So when we care, we hurt more until we can manage the hurt. So like that's sort of most people who are injured have numbing of some sort readily available that they've been using their whole life. And when you care, that numbing can't be there anymore because it's not supposed to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I think it explains it in a way, in a way that I haven't heard a lot. Oftentimes, the specifics of that are just kind of left for people to think about, but not really. We don't really talk about that much, and I think it's really helpful for, again, newer clinicians out there. As we kind of wind down here, Christine, you talked a little bit about your own experience doing therapy in a sense. For those people out there who are doing that, and I've heard a lot of people are struggling with it. Some people, of course, aren't, but there are a number of people who are. What are your thoughts for them? What are your thoughts for just therapists in particular who are managing and dealing with this?
Right. I would ask the therapists to really do an investigation of their own attachment style, of their own relational needs. If as a therapist, during your day when you're with your clients face to face, is there something that happens that in that personal relationship that either helps you be a more effective therapist or is actually getting in the way of you being an effective therapist, and you can't do that anymore, right? So I would be wondering, how is your relational dynamics affecting you personally? So for me, I've been doing teletherapy for a very long time because I am quite specialized. There's not very many people who do what I do, both either in the sensory motor world and also in the dissociative world and in the mindfulness world. So I do have people that I've been seeing for years doing teletherapy. And because I work with such a dissociative population, they actually don't mind it too much. But if you have also clients who really do thrive off that relational dynamic that happens in the office, your clients might not be acting the same, and that might be confusing you. So the groove that you may have gotten into face to face may have changed. Have a conversation about the relational dynamics. Have a conversation about how much we need people. Some people really need people, and some people are really uncomfortable with people. And in that, and the screen can stop that relational dynamic from happening, which might make you have to struggle a lot more about something that you don't normally deal with. And so, it sort of just adds in an extra dynamic that you may or may not be aware of because of the relational piece.
Awesome. So what's the best way for people to get in contact with you? Because I'm guessing a lot of people are thinking, oh my God, I want to learn more about what she's teaching. I want that.
So obviously there's there's a few journal articles that I've written one on mindfulness. I can send them all to, I can send all my open access to you, the one on mindfulness and dissociation. And then this current one, I also have written a book, the dissociation and mindfulness book. I can be reached at my web, on my, the CF at Associated Counseling, which is my email, and my website as well at Associated Counseling up in Canada. Awesome. I do have a lot of training material, a lot of webinars and a lot of teaching material at ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. There's a lot of my webinars are on there as well.
Oh, cool. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you, man. I love talking to you. You're just like a wealth of integral information that this podcast needs. So
Yeah, thank you. Anytime. My
all right.
pleasure.
Well, I'd love to have you back. So
Yeah.
after all the dust clears with all of this stuff, we'll talk again.
Yes.
All right, Christine, take care.
Thank you, Guy. Bye, everyone. Be well and food.
All right, take care.
Thank you.